Thank you, Shahana, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. So just first, I'll just do a bit of housekeeping. So for this session, as part of the Q&A, we'd love you to be very sort of interactive with our panelists today. So what I'd ask is towards the end of the session, we'll have microphones available on each side, and don't hesitate. As soon as you've sort of thought of a question, please put your hand up. We'll make sure a microphone gets to you, and hopefully we'll have a lot of productive discussion. So g'day everyone. We have an excellent range of panellists today. Margie Osmond from Tourism Transport Forum Australia, Graham Potger from Qantas, Brigadier Gabby Follett from the Australian Government Department of Defence, and Stephen Bartholomews from Neste. As Shahana mentioned, my name is James Williamson, and I lead Neste's Australian team. Probably the first thing you'll notice about Neste is that we're not Australian. We are, in fact, Finnish. To date, our facilities have not been located in Australia, and although through the construction of Singapore, we are in the region, we have been actively developing the feedstock market here since 2011. Linking to the session's theme today, I felt the Neste story might serve as a real-world example of what is achievable in the transition to renewables. As you can see, we started our existence many years ago as a conventional oil refiner in 1948. But over the last 20 years, we have migrated our business almost fully over to producing renewable fuels such as SAF. You could say that Neste was a front runner, pioneering the technology pathway often referred to today as HEFA. Behind me, I have included the operational dates of our global renewable refineries, and as you can see, many of these have been running for over a decade. And the point that I'd particularly like to emphasize here is that these plants are not subject to FID. They are built and they are operational. And hopefully, by the end of next year, we look to be producing about 6.8 million metric tons, or 8,700 megalitres of renewable fuel. Regarding SAF, we often hear that commitment to any volume of SAF is today untenable due to either its expense or availability. Well, with any new product, there is often a ramp-up period. I'm here to tell you that today, Neste is distributing SAF globally, and we'd love to see some Aussie logos up on this slide one day. It is worth mentioning that one of the significant factors adding to SAF's green premium is the reality that supply chains are still being established. For example, cargo sizes for SAF are a fraction of those typically shipped for conventional jet fuel. With this last slide, I would like to, the last slide I'd like to leave you with as we explore this topic, I have borrowed from our good friends at Argus Media. This is a non-exhaustive map of the announced SAF projects globally, with those actually operational in orange. To ensure the industry's credibility, we need to move beyond conditional announcements to actually having skin in the game. And I would invite you to hold us accountable and to make sure that we actually deliver on what we have promised. So on that note, I would gladly like to welcome our first panelist, Margie Osmond, to speak on the consumer's acceptance of, and perception of SAF. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. I would probably have to start by saying I'm so pleased to be making an active contribution to my steps tally by the distance we've got to travel to the lectern this morning. And I would also like to confirm Catherine King's discussion this morning about good reasons for you to go to the shop downstairs. It did, in fact, win a silver award on Friday night at the National Tourism Awards. So do go downstairs and enjoy a tourism experience at the gallery shop. I should probably just tell you a little bit about TTF and who the heck we are in the scheme of things. We're the national lobby and advocacy group for the tourism and transport sectors. We only have about 100 members, but it's all the biggest players in the space and certainly the biggest players in the aviation space. So for us, a discussion about sustainability and SAF is critical. Okay. because you can't do anything these days without a little bit of consumer research. We have, over the last couple of years, been doing quite a deal of research to see, what do people think about it, how much do they know about it. One of the biggest issues for us is going to be, in fact, education for travellers to understand where SAF fits into the scheme of things and why it may lead to slightly more expensive airline tickets at some point in the future. So, off the back of a piece of work that was done quite recently, 82% of Australians said they think it was important for Australia to find ways to reduce carbon emissions produced by air travel. The sentiment was most strongly held by 18 to 24-year-olds. I'm not certain that will be a big surprise. 86% of them said it was important. However, the overwhelming majority of older Australians agreed. Something like 77% of 65-year-olds. So this is, an interesting across-the-board recognition of a need to do something. Geographically, this was most important to residents of New South Wales, perhaps not surprisingly given it is the gateway state to Australia from an aviation point of view, and Western Australia, followed by Tasmania. So there's a bit of a pattern emerging here. Australia is a long-haul destination. We will never be anything but a long-haul destination, and just about everything within Australia is a long-haul destination. We don't have other transport opportunities like high-speed rail, for example, which would be an ameliorating factor somewhere like Europe. It won't be the case here, so aviation will continue to be critical, and that is why we as an industry are so fixated on the need for a SAF industry here in Australia. So let's have a look at what they think about SAF in particular. So something like 86% of Australians said they'd support the development of a local SAF industry. That's got to be very good news. Let's hope that's very good news that encourages the government to start spending a bit more money in this space. Interestingly though, the ones who are most alert to the SAF opportunities are those who are over 65. Now, it may very well be because they're looking at it from potential investment with superannuation funds, etc., but it is that older group, something like 91% of them said that it was critical for us to develop a local industry in this space. Strongest sentiment in favour of this, actually, interestingly, is in the ACT. So, just moving along, just having a bit more of a look at consumer trends in this space, and I'm very conscious that quite often, people have the opportunity to carbon offset and do all sorts of things when they buy an airline ticket, and they don't always do it. But there is certainly a level of increasing interest and increasing desire to see progress in this SAF space, and I think, as I say, incumbent on us is the need for a fairly significant education campaign. So the knowledge of SAF has been steadily increasing around the world over the last few years. When the first commercial flight actually crossed the Atlantic using 100% SAF fuel, Virgin Atlantic flight made headlines after flying from London's Heathrow Airport to JFK in New York using fuel made from waste fats and plant sugars. I would say to you just at that point too, having said waste product and plant sugars, for the tourism industry, we're really, really clear that our biggest partners in this space have to be the agricultural industry and the farmers. There is a need to understand that feedstock availability for the fuel has to be balanced back against other population needs in terms of that agricultural product, and a level of understanding that it's not just about waste and how important the ag sector is in this space, for us particularly. So what are the actual costs of inaction in this space? What are we going to see if we don't do something about this sooner rather than later from a tourism perspective? And I do want to stress, I'm from the tourism industry, I'm not from the fuel industry, so I'm going to be somewhat one-eyed about what the implications are for the tourism sector and for those travellers. I think probably the biggest symptom of inaction in this is we are already seeing across the world an impact on people's attitude towards long-haul flights and what the carbon implications of that might be. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about a specific example in that space in a second. But it is going to be an issue around flight availability and flight costs. Popular holiday spots, one of our biggest growth areas at the moment for international travel is in fact Japan. and the UK, of course, but Japan. So they're talking about mandates by 2030. That's going to have significant implications for the price of airline tickets. So from our industry's perspective, there is a need to understand this and to be developing whatever process is going to give us the best possible outcome on the ground and in the air. So in terms of specific impacts, I want to talk to you about business events. Now, business events inject a significant and massive amount of money into the tourism economy. It sort of sits somewhere in the area of about $17 billion a year. Increasingly, what happens now when you go overseas to bid for one of these global conferences to come to Australia, and it's big business. Everybody meets in Frankfurt once a year and has a discussion about which kind of business event is going to go where. Increasingly now, Australia has to justify its bid because we are long haul. And for many businesses, they A, don't want to take part in a conference that is going to do damage to their own carbon targets, nor do they want to send a whole lot of delegates to a conference that's that far away. So we are already seeing really significant impacts on our attractiveness as a business events destination in the early stages of this. There is also an element that says to you major events of any kind. I don't know how many of you took yourself off to the Taylor Swift concert. Show of hands. Oh, go on, fess up. There you go. Well, for what we're seeing now with some of those major events is that there will be an increasing unwillingness to bring those events somewhere like Australia when it's so far away and there will be so many carbon impacts of it. And in addition to that, they won't travel as far when they get here. So somebody like Taylor Swift in future won't go to every capital city. She didn't this time. She only did Melbourne and Sydney. That will be an increasing trend. More events in less places. So it will change the map and it will start a larger change in terms of those consumers and their willingness to travel. So let's just have a look at what the rest of the world's doing in this space. Because we're a research organisation, we couldn't help ourselves. Our friends at LEK did a little piece of work for us looking at where we sit globally. I think the most important thing to understand is just about everybody's spending more money than we are. It would be fair to say that from our point of view, the investment at this stage is about 30 million, thereabouts. Countries like Singapore are in the 60 million range. The UK is 320 million to develop their own local industry and counting. The Canadians are sitting at 550 million, and with some of the wonderful legislative impacts in America, it looks like a $7 billion investment through their Inflation Reduction Act. So we're a long way behind the 8 ball. So the next issue, of course, and one that's been discussed a little bit already this morning, is the issue around feedstock. Australia's not too badly placed in this space. Canada, obviously, better, and the US, pretty good. But interestingly, countries like China and others, not so good. So there's going to be some serious challenges. For us, in relation to this also, we tend to think that this is a neighbourhood. So New Zealand has virtually no capacity to produce SAF. The Pacific, which relies, 95% of its economy is based on tourism. It's got almost zip capacity to produce SAF and be able to be a player in this space. There is a regional requirement, I think, for us to understand our neighbours' needs and view that as an opportunity going forward. And they've just flashed the very quick thing at me, so I'm going to flick through some of these. So this is an assessment we've had done of the feedstock capacity. I'm happy to circulate that if people would like a version of that. Obviously, a whole range of airlines are doing fairly impressive things, and I will leave it to my colleague from Qantas to talk specifically about where Qantas is going. But I think it's one of those spaces where the industry itself has recognised they need to step up, and that is exactly what they're doing. In addition to that, beyond SAF and the attraction and procurement of new airplanes, etc., we're also seeing people like IFM, who's the investment arm of Host Plus, which is the superannuation company that covers our industry, forming a partnership with GrainCorp here in Australia to look at feedstock capacities, to look at what this is going to be, and to actually have an active role and skin in the game and investment dollar in the game. So just in conclusion, in terms of further policy steps, from our point of view, Like everybody else, I suppose, in this room, we've made our submissions to the aviation white paper, and we have, of course, made very significant submissions to the government in terms of the upcoming budget. We'd like to see at least $300 million invested into the SAF industry, its development, over the next 4 years of the forward estimates, as a combination of grants and a range of tax concessions, etc., to encourage that industry literally off the ground. So thank you all very much. I'm going to go pre-bell and look forward to having a conversation with all of you during the course of the day.
Good morning, everyone. I wanted to just start by saying how encouraged I am to see a room full of people at a SAF conference, and that follows on a sold-out event last night, which just is really encouraging to see a bit of momentum gathering behind this topic. And I wanted to thank the bioenergy team and Shahana in particular for pulling this together. For those of you who I haven't met before, my name's Graham Potger. I'm the head of SAF at Qantas Group. So my day job is to help shape Qantas's SAF strategy and to try and figure out what a supply chain looks like for us to meet our 2030 and beyond target. And that's no easy feat. Obviously, we're starting in a country that doesn't have supportive policy. There's not a whole lot of production, and there's a lot of industry building required in order for us to meet our targets. So from a headline level, some of you in the room might know that we set a 10% target by 2030. What that translates to when you look at our expected fuel use is about 650 million litres of SAF that we need to be using by 2030. So as was pointed out last night, I think we've got 69 months left until that date. So there is some real urgency that needs to happen in this country to help us support that target. Beyond 2030, our trajectory goes up to about 3.5 billion litres by 2050. So demand is clearly there. Every year after 2030, we need incrementally 100 million litres more. So at times it feels a little bit like, when you see the Olympic swimmers going for that world record and the red line keeps pulling away, it feels a little bit like that, but I think we're up for the challenge. And so we're scouring all the places that we operate to for SAF, and there are a number of areas that we can get it from. But what is clear when you look at the fact that we pick up 70% of our fuel domestically is that on any scenario, we're going to need a domestic SAF industry here in this country. And so we recognised that pretty quickly a couple of years ago, and in partnership with Airbus, what jumped off the page to us was that we're going to have some skin in the game and help catalyse this market. So we got together with Airbus and we pulled together a US $200 million, so roughly $300 million Australian fund that is directed at catalysing the Australian SAF production. And so what I thought I'd do today was just to give you relatively high level 4 lenses that we use to assess opportunities that are coming through that fund, to give you some ideas around what we're looking for in terms of support. So we've been at it now for sort of 18 months, 2 years now, and we've sort of really refined our approach. But what has been clear to us is that in the market there is a real need for early development capital. So there are lots of pockets of capital around, and I see some in the room represented. But the early piece is difficult to obtain if you're an independent project developer, so the first $20 million. So we've basically styled ourselves a little bit on a catalytic impact type fund. So we're looking to provide money to get the ball rolling and attract other capital in. And by doing that, we need to sort of sift through the various opportunities and start putting a lens on the opportunities we're going to help support. So over these next 4 slides, I'm going to give you some sense of how we're narrowing down the field. So this slide's pretty customary. There's lots of versions of it. This one is slightly skewed in that I think it underestimates heifer in that first phase. But generally, SAF development is broken down into 3 phases. So you have the heifer stage in the first step, which is all the oils to fuel. Then in the second phase, you have the more advanced second generation ways of making SAF. And we heard from Jimmy earlier in the last session, and alcohol to jet is an example of that. And phase 3, as we see it, is your power to liquids, including potentially using biogenic CO2 as the CO2 source. So we look at it in the same sort of 3-phase step, but we take a different sort of investment posture with respect to each. So in phase 1, our take of the market is that it's pretty well developed. There are a lot of well-resourced large organisations that are pursuing the heifer pathway. I think the technological readiness and the commercial readiness of that solution is established, so we're going to let that part of the market develop on its own, and we'll access it from an off-take perspective in due course, and there's a slide I'll come back to on that. So we're very deliberate in our fund at looking at accelerating sort of phase 2 and phase 3. And in particular, we want to try and bring forward the development timeframes. The next lens that I wanted to put on our investment strategy is that although $300 million sounds like a significant sum, in terms of the industry building that we want to do, there are limits to how far you can stretch it. So we have to be very tactical in the way that we deploy it. And the concept that we're anchoring around is this removing roadblocks style investing. So we've looked around the country, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, and we've understood potential ways of making SAF, potential feedstocks, and what the supply chain looks like. And we've studied those very closely, and what we're trying to identify is in each jurisdiction as you move around the country, where are the roadblocks, or where is there a blocker or a potential derailer for that end-to-end supply? Because I think from our perspective, there's not a lot of benefit if we make a whole lot of investments upstream, but for various reasons that doesn't actually materialise into fuel into our wing. So we'll raise a focus on making sure from a portfolio perspective, while we're trying to remove roadblocks in the supply chain, it eventuates into SAF into our wings, because at the end of the day we'll be marked on our target. So if you look at that, what occurs to us, for example, in the feedstock supply, I think it's well known that the heifer pathway, while it's commercially ready, there are constraints around feedstock supply. So we are looking at opportunities at novel heifer feedstocks. We're looking at non-food type crops, potentially growing on marginal lands. Those sort of opportunities to help scale heifer to the size that we need it to get to. Similarly, if we look at blending and distribution, there's still a blending cap obviously on SAF, and we will need blending capability, particularly into regional airports. So how do we sort that out? And we're very keen to look at technological solutions that assist us in that. Also the last part, and this has been touched on in previous comments, but it's going to be very key to address the green premium for our customers, both corporate and consumers, to take some collective action in terms of sharing the green premium. And one of the earlier panellists talked about a book and claim system, which is the methodology that underpins that. We've also brought together a SAF coalition, so an early collection and cohort of corporates who want to pioneer in this space. But eventually, I think if we are to scale that part of the equation, and this is the distribution of the Scope 3 attributes, it's going to need a digital solution. So something akin to ACCUs and the carbon markets. So we are intently studying options around there, and there are a few popping up, but it's an equally important part of the value chain for us. So this slide, I just wanted to go through some high-level thematics around what we're focusing on from an investment perspective. So I think it's very key for us to try to accelerate the first litre of domestic fuel. I think it really drives the policy production once the fuel starts flowing, so we're keen on doing that. Our focus is on Queensland, so our assessment is that there are a lot of comparative advantages in Queensland, and we've invested together with Airbus in a project called Jet Zero, using LanzaJet technology in Townsville. I talked about the advanced SAF support. I talked about the non-food feedstock development. We're very keen on enabling technology, so any technology out there that increases scale or allows access to a greater subset of feedstock. And also the last one is boomerang partnerships. So we're very conscious that a lot of the technology is coming out from other jurisdictions. So we're looking to identify partners that have a footprint in those jurisdictions, can help develop a project perhaps in a more advantageous jurisdiction, but importantly come back and bring that technology to Australia. The last slide, and I won't dwell on this one, but obviously there's another dimension as we sort of build a portfolio here. So we're very keen to keep an eye on how we market this to our corporates and our customers, and these particular ways of making fuel are resonating well in our early testing. We also see the eventual offtake portfolio as being a tiered type approach, and we're going to be accessing the different types of SAF as we build that up. And then our corporate customers are already starting to request SAF on both ends of our key business routes in order to meet their own targets. So our procurement strategy will revolve around this bookend approach as we look at our network. So I might just stop there because I got the buzzer, but thanks for listening in. Cheers.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today on the future of operational energy for the Australian Defence Force. As introduced, I'm the Director General of Fuel Services for Defence. My team is responsible for the operation, maintenance and development of the defence fuel capability. By this, I mean that we're responsible for the infrastructure, the people and the relationships that supply, store, distribute and manage fuel of all types in support of Australian Defence Force operations, training and preparedness across the globe. We are also responsible, just as a small side job, for coordinating the ADF's transition to renewable, less carbon-intensive energy types for military operations. My presentation this morning will highlight at a fairly broad level the opportunities, lessons and outcomes of a sustainable aviation fuel demonstration that Defence conducted at the 2023 Newcastle Williamtown Air Show. This demonstration was conducted as an early step under Defence's developing strategy for future energy, which I will speak to a little bit further this afternoon. Liquid fuels are key for the conduct of ADF operations. At risk of stating the blindingly obvious, most of our platforms, our ships, our aircraft, our vehicles, and increasingly our space capabilities, and in some cases our missiles, depend upon liquid fuels to operate. Although Defence is a relatively small consumer of fuel in Australia, we use around 1% of the nation's total fuel across all types. We are the largest federal government user of fuel. More critically, at a time of crisis or conflict, the Defence demand for fuel is expected to increase. During such a crisis or conflict, our national economy will also need to continue to function, and some aspects of the economy may need to increase in tempo. Because of this, the 2023 Defence Strategic Review highlighted fuel and energy as a critical requirement for national resilience. It also directed that Defence accelerate our transition to clean energy to increase national resilience. And any avid readers of the Defence Strategic Review out there will know that our plan is due back to government by 2025. To achieve this, we are working to finalise an overarching strategy that describes the what and the why for our transition to future energies, and I'll speak more to what this strategy might look like this afternoon. Within this strategy, renewable fuels such as SAF and renewable diesel are the most viable options for the ADF to transition to without intolerable risk to our mission. Although certain exemptions are available to defence and the broader national security sector, we are committed to reducing our carbon emissions and to contributing to the government's targets. As an early step towards understanding how we will make this transition and implement our future energy strategy, in November 2023, Defence demonstrated the use of SAF in Royal Australian Air Force Pilatus PC-21 aircraft during the Newcastle Williamtown Air Show. And the plane spotters among you will know that the PC-21s are more broadly known as the RAF roulettes. This successful demonstration was a collaboration between Air Force, my team in Joint Capabilities Group, and our fuel industry supply partner Viva Energy Australia. The demonstration's success was due not only to the fact that the fuel was supplied and the aircraft performed as expected, although both those things occurred. The demonstration was a success in that it identified considerable lessons along the way. It was an excellent example of what seemed like a fairly simple activity that contained underlying layers of complexity that we worked through collaboratively, including in partnership with industry, to resolve and learn much more than we had anticipated at the start. As many of you will be aware, defence fuel specifications differ from the commercial aviation industry, requiring commercial jet fuel to be additised or dosed to meet military specifications, creating F-34 or F-44. The bespoke process to additise, transport and deliver the SAF required to enable the demonstration was considerably more complicated than originally anticipated. To conduct the demonstration, through Viva Energy, we imported two 24,000 litre isotainers containing a 30% SAF blend from Europe. Initially, rehearsals and confident flights were conducted at East Sale, where the aircraft are usually based, and the fuel was then transported to Williamtown Air Base for the conduct of the demonstration. These rehearsals were important for enabling the pilots to be confident in the performance of the aircraft using SAF, a key part of our education program within Defence, and pretty important if you're the guy or girl who's performing those acrobatics. Procurement of the SAF in relatively small quantities in those ISO containers, combined with the requirement that we had to keep the SAF segregated from our usual storage of aviation fuel at East Sale and at Williamtown, created some challenges. This segregation was necessary to prevent the SAF from being issued to defence platforms that were, at the time, yet to be confirmed as able to use SAF. We therefore used two aviation refuelling vehicles as temporary storage, allowing the fixed fuel installations to continue to supply fossil-based aviation fuel to other aircraft. These circumstances required a bespoke additisation process consisting of 60 manual handling steps over a 13-hour period. The personnel requirements included 7 Viva Energy technical specialists with support from my team and from Air Force. Hoses and fittings were customised to transfer the SAF from a chemical transporter vehicle to a Viva refuelling vehicle, through a portable dosing unit and into the 2 defence refuelling vehicles that we used as the storage means. This bespoke supply and logistics model for the demonstration was challenging and less cost-effective due to the labour required, and it also exposed the people involved to the safety risks that are inherent in dosing fuel with those chemicals. That it worked was an absolute credit to those who developed it, and it's a really great demonstration of what we can do in a partnership between industry and defence, but it was cumbersome and it was slow and it added cost to the process. Although the complexity was largely driven by the small volume and the requirement for segregation, the experience considerably enhanced our knowledge and our experience. We are also currently actively learning from our partner militaries, most notably the United Kingdom and the Royal Air Force, who are developing experience in using higher blends of SAF and the associated impacts on their ground support equipment, particularly when used over a longer period of time. So what next? I'm cautious not to get ahead of decisions that are yet to be made internally within Defence. But what we are hoping to do as our next step is to operate a defence base on sustainable aviation fuel for a period of time, hopefully up to around 12 months and potentially beyond. This is already, just as a process of planning and exploration, having a significant impact upon accelerating the process necessary to enable defence aircraft to use SAF. This will in turn remove the requirement for fuel segregation, which means we can work with Viva to simplify the supply chain, most particularly the additisation process. Importantly, it will enable the SAF to be delivered directly into the defence fuel installation at the base that we end up choosing, which will make things far more effective and efficient. What we are also looking at is renewable diesel trial, potentially in a naval vessel. And I know that much of the discussion here today has been about SAF. For Defence, we don't want to lose sight of renewable diesel for our maritime capabilities and for our land capabilities. We are looking at conducting that renewable diesel trial within the course of this calendar year. The cost of SAF, and indeed potentially the cost of renewable diesel compared with mineral fuel types, remains a key limitation for us. Defence's budget is not small, but it is finite, and that includes the fuel budget within it. And this is no doubt the case for other users. But if approved, the conduct of these next steps will enable us to learn lessons from the protracted use of SAF and hopefully renewable diesel. It is also a key part of educating our people on the opportunities resident in renewable fuels. Critically, we also hope to send a clear signal to industry that Defence is committed to using renewable fuels and that this is a long-term commitment from us. Thank you. I look forward to discussing our future energy strategy further this afternoon.
Good morning. I'm Stephen Bartholomews, and I'm the Head of Public Affairs for Neste for the Asia Pacific region. I'm delighted to be here. This is my second Australian Renewable Fuels Week, and it's great to see such a large audience. And I think in some ways, like my topic, how policies are enabling the growth of renewable fuels, or in this case, particularly sustainable aviation fuel, it's nice to see the growth of the audience at Australian Renewable Fuels Week as well. Well, clearly, aviation needs to decarbonize. If you look at our current emissions, it's at about 2 or 3%, but these are set to grow as the aviation industry also continues to grow. And if you just look at sort of the non-CO2 impacts of aviation, the actual emissions are significantly higher. So the aviation industry needs to change, it needs to decarbonize, and to reach the goal of net zero by 2050, sustainable aviation fuel presents the best opportunity. The reality is that we are in a regulated market, and if you look at sustainable aviation fuel, it's really regulations that are driving and accelerating the growth of this industry. So if you look at the global market outlook, in 2023, we were using less than 1 million tons of sustainable aviation fuel, driven by mandates in countries like France, Norway, and Sweden. And in 2025, this number is set to grow to about 4 million tons, largely driven by the EU Refuel Initiative, which is a mandate, as well as opt-in schemes and other mandated schemes coming on stream in other regions. As has been presented in the previous panel, this industry is then set to grow to about 15 million tons by 2030, largely driven by long-term drivers. So the overall 70% SAF mandate under Refuel EU in 2050, as well as some of IATA's targets for net zero by 2050, as well as the development of mandates in markets like Japan and Singapore. Now, the continued growth of this market, as I mentioned, will require policy support to drive investments. And if you look at the United States, the European and Middle East region, and then Asia Pacific, we see initiatives like those in British Columbia, where they have a 10% SAF target by 2030. The European Union, driven again by Refuel EU, going from 2% to 6%. But I just want to focus here on the Asia Pacific region, because my role sort of covers the developments around policy in this region. And Japan's pretty much been the front runner in this space with the announcement of a 10% target by 2030. Countries like New Zealand have been talking about setting up sustainable aviation fuel mandates, but we haven't still seen any announcements there. Singapore has moved fairly fast, a 1% target by 2026, going to between 3 to 5% in 2030. And then there are announcements by countries like India and others around targets around 2026 to 2030. I just want to highlight this slide, however, because it is a busy slide, but in some ways it's kind of connected to the slide that James shared earlier from Argus, which talks about industry development and what the industry is proposing to do. In some ways, this is just the Asia Pacific region, and these are some of the proposed policies and discussions that are taking place. And what I've actually highlighted here are the actual policies that are in place. And the only two countries that have policies in place right now are Japan, that announced a target initially at the end of 2022. They then changed this target to a mandate in May last year. And they are now working in this current Diet session to actually legislate this mandate. And in addition to legislating the mandate, they are also developing policies to enable the domestic production of SAF. This includes setting up a fund of about 27 billion yen over the next 10 years to fund domestic SAF projects, and the announcement of a 30 yen per litre tax credit for domestically produced SAF. Singapore, Neste has been very much a part of the International Advisory Panel that was set up in February 2022 to develop the Sustainable Hub Blueprint. And in a period of 2 years, so on February 19th this year, Singapore announced the Sustainable Hub Blueprint, including a target of 1% by 2025, going to between 3 to 5% by 2030. So a very small target, but nevertheless, it's 1%, and 1% is always better than 0%. And we see sort of a robust long-term supply and demand outlook for renewable products, driven by developments in front-runner countries like Japan and Singapore, the growth of SAF, but also new technologies coming on stream, like what was presented in the panel before ours. And at Neste, we are really taking charge of change and driving the growth of our own domestic SAF, of our own sustainable aviation fuel production. So growing from 100,000 tons in 2022, by the end of this year, we hope to be producing about 1.5 million tons of sustainable aviation fuel in our facilities in Singapore and Rotterdam. And then with further enhancements to Rotterdam by 2026, we plan on producing about 2.2 million tons of sustainable aviation fuel, growing to about 3 million tons of sustainable aviation fuel by 2030. So we are on a growth trajectory, and we see the demand for sustainable aviation fuel. But I want to just very quickly shift, because I thought it'd be a good opportunity to highlight and showcase a very recent development around policies to enable the growth of sustainable aviation fuel. And I'm very thankful to the Civil Aviation Authority of Singapore for sharing a couple of slides that showcase the Sustainable Hub Blueprint. Now, the blueprint covers 3 initiatives. So there are initiatives in the airport domain, the air traffic management domain, and then in the airline domain, and the airline domain is largely driven by SAF. Underpinning these domains is the critical enablers, so the development of policies. And I'll just focus here for the purposes of this audience on the work that is being done around sustainable aviation fuel in Singapore. So firstly, to kickstart the adoption of sustainable aviation fuel in Singapore, flights departing Singapore will be required to use sustainable aviation fuel from 2026 onwards, starting with a 1% target and then growing to 3 to 5% by 2030. I think the other key point here is the introduction of a sustainable aviation fuel levy. So the Civil Aviation Authority will introduce a levy for the purchase of sustainable aviation fuel so that they can achieve that uplift target. And this is being done because, as all of you know, the SAF market is at a very nascent stage at this point. And to drive growth, this levy will be set at a fixed quantum based on that initial 1% SAF target and the price point of sustainable aviation fuel at that time. And the levy will also be based on a range of factors, such as the distance that you travel, as well as the class of travel. So just as an example, as you can see here, a flight to Bangkok will cost you an additional $3 Singapore dollars, based on that 1% target, $6 to Tokyo, and then around $16 to London. Additionally, there will be also a centralized procurement process for sustainable aviation fuel, and this is largely being done to manage the cost of the procurement of sustainable aviation fuel. And finally, Singapore wants to be the SAF hub for certainly for the ASEAN region, but also for the Asia Pacific region. And this is largely being done to attract investments into Singapore. So this overall sustainable air hub blueprint also links very closely with the sustainable Jurong Island plan. So Jurong Island is a petrochemical hub, and they are transitioning that island into a sustainable petrochemical hub. So as you can see, there are a range of policy levers that can be put in place to really drive growth of the sustainable aviation fuel industry. Singapore's example is just one, but as you've heard from the panels earlier this morning as well, you have mandates, you have incentive type schemes. What's the best scheme? I'm not really sure myself, but I think you need a range of policy levers to drive growth in the sustainable aviation fuel industry. Thank you.
Okay, so this is where the fun bit, and we get to hear from you directly. Now, before we jump into the Q&A, I'd first like to invite everyone just to give our panelists another round of applause for those very excellent speeches. So our microphones are roving. Just to get us started though, I might actually ask a question myself. So to Brigadier Gabby, I noticed that obviously there's a lot of skills and talent and expertise that's required in this new industry that we're seeking to build. How has your assessment been from where you stand in terms of the available skill sets within the Australian workforce today and the young sort of recruits that you had coming through?
Yeah, so thanks, James. It's a good question. What we're finding is that we can't do this with a military workforce. In fact, we probably can't even do this with a Commonwealth workforce. It's really critical that in making this transition, Defence works collaboratively with industry, because in our view, it's only industry that can grow the necessary technical skill set that we need to leverage and can keep it contemporary. Our experience has been if you bring those skill sets into a Commonwealth workforce, be it public service or military, we're going to struggle to pay them enough to keep them, so retention becomes an immediate issue for us. But even more critically than that, we struggle to keep the skill set contemporary. So what we are looking to do, and I think it's well communicated in the Defence Strategic Review, is work in partnership with industry to better understand industry, but also help industry better understand us and ensure that Defence's needs aren't some sort of black box that are a bit of a mystery.
How are we going? Any questions? I might open that up to our other panellists. Margie, how do you see it from a tourism standpoint?
Look, I think this is an across-the-board problem. It's a global skills shortage because everybody is attempting now to fill this space. In a wider sustainability sphere, across the board for the tourism industry, we can't get the people who can help us build systems and then measure them to appropriately fit in with what government requirements and policy requirements are going to be. It is a big issue, and it's one of the reasons the federal government has now put together a whole range of new skills clusters to do workforce planning for the next decade. So I would encourage all of you, if you're given the opportunity to contribute to those workforce planning exercises, please do, because skills in this fuel space are going to be so critical to all of us.
Thank you. For yourself, Graham, being very customer focused as Qantas is, how do you see the perception? You did sort of touch on it in your speech, but is there more that we can do with regards to education and SAF, or sustainable aviation fuel, as a product to the sort of average consumer?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to do actually, because our early survey testing, when we tested with some audiences their base level of knowledge on SAF, there was next to no one who even knew what the acronym was. But we were encouraged, like once it was explained to them, intuitively consumers gave it about a 20-point lift over offsets as a way to decarbonise their flight. So that gives us a little bit of encouragement. There's also some demographics as well that comes into play. So as a generalisation, some of the younger generations are more active, more altruistic, and there's less of a translation issue between saying what they're going to do and actually doing it and ticking the box. But I think underpinning it all is there's a real need for the industry as a whole to increase just the level of awareness. And it's not an easy task because, I think as the two sessions have pointed out, there's lots of nuance to it. There's lots of ways of making it. There's lots of moving pieces to the SAF story. But I think if we can simplify it down and do it in a way that resonates to the layperson, I think we'll start to get a little bit of religion around this from a consumer perspective, which will be really important for us going forward.
Excellent. Oh, there we go. We've got a question at the back. Thank you.
Hello, Tim Stock from Green Power. A question's for Margie, but also for the other panel, and you had some good consumer resource about the wanting to have options and being able to do something about having clean air travel and what have you, but the question is about the willingness to pay. So what is the consumer's willingness to pay, and at what level does it become a policy mandate or the ability for consumers to make decisions to purchase a more expensive flight or a more expensive option?
Well, look, as a representative of the tourism industry, it pains me to suggest that travellers are going to have to pay more, but I think, unfortunately, in the future, there is going to be an additional cost to aviation. That's all there is to it, at least in the short to medium term. I think the critical issue, though, is transparency, because this kind of development and activity goes way beyond opting in and opting out. It will become a public policy issue for government, and not necessarily into the future a matter of choice for travellers. If they want to travel, there will be some sort of fee potentially that will be associated with that travel. Simply because if we've got to move into the space of using SAF, it's going to cost more. And those countries that choose to put in place mandates will also add another factor, or those that choose to put in place systems like the Singaporean one. So the big challenge for us is not only educating people about SAF, but educating that it comes with a price tag.
Over on the left.
Thank you. Excuse me. Angus Whitley from Bloomberg News here. Question for Graham. Graham, you talked a little about demand from your corporate clients for SAF at both ends of like big business routes. How do you manage those demands when you don't have any SAF production at the ends, at both ends? And also, could you talk a little bit about how SAF and more broadly emissions are influencing your corporate contracts as a whole? How is that sort of dominating compared to cost?
Yeah, look, the first thing we've done is obviously set up that SAF coalition. So SAF supply around the network that we operate to is very limited. So we're taking it out of London, and essentially we're prototyping a program where we use a book and claim methodology to take the attributes and then apply them to Australian corporates. Now, that system needs to be underpinned by a regulatory framework, and so one of our policy suggestions is that there are what called SAFC frameworks out there, and the World Economic Forum, for example, has one. So we think that that's part of the regulatory picture. So that's the first step. But I think, you know, in trying to promote that program, I've had, you know, hundreds of conversations with corporate Australia around each of their views, and some sectors are feeling it more acutely than others. So particularly professional services, you know, management consultants, those kind of groups, their employee travels and the emissions from their employee travel is probably their second biggest source of scope 3 emissions. And they can tackle the emissions around their offices, but then it's pretty quickly it's employee travel. And they do not want, for employment reasons, to tell their employees to travel less, because it's kind of part of the value proposition. So that's where we're getting some queries around, you know, when is this coming online? How can we participate, you know, more entirely with the process? And we're reading the tea leaves, for example, and, you know, it's very clear to us, for example, that Trans-Tasman, Trans-Pacific, Australia into Singapore, and on the west coast into Europe, we are going to have to progressively get SAF on both ends of those key ports. So not only are we looking at investment in Australia for one end of the bookend, but we're looking also at those ports. And, you know, that's why we've signed an offtake in California. We're focusing a lot of our attention on US offtakes as well. But we'll have to do it progressively.
Maybe one for you, Stephen. I feel like you've been left out. So we've been talking, obviously, very heavily about SAF. I'm mindful of the topic. But also, at least from a HEFA standpoint, and I believe for other technology paths, renewable diesel consequently will be produced. So for you, Stephen, what sort of friction points do you see that we might be able to remove in terms of making that widely available within Australia and New Zealand?
Yeah, so I think just before I comment on your question, James, I want to just add a couple of points to comments made by Graham and Margie around education. I think that's really critical. We need to help people understand, first of all, what is sustainable aviation fuel and why is it important and what benefits does it bring. But I also think we need to educate people around the actual cost, as Margie pointed out, that there'll be an additional cost to travel. When Singapore made the announcement around the 1% SAF target, and then they broke down those numbers, you know, $3 Singapore dollars to Bangkok, $6 to Japan, and $16 to London. The social media in Singapore was just pretty much 95% of what was said in social media was critical about, oh, now our flights are going to become more expensive. But that's just the reality. And I think, you know, putting it in perspective, I happened to travel to Melbourne before coming here, and having a what they call a kopi si kosong, which is a black coffee with milk, and a piece of kaya toast, which is a piece of toast with coconut jam. Cost me $12 at the airport. So, I mean, $6 around that to get to Melbourne is not really a lot. But I think in terms of the friction, I think we got to look at this whole industry, even here in Australia, holistically. It can't be just about sustainable aviation fuel alone. Yes, aviation is a hard-to-abate sector, and we need solutions to tackle that. But you have to look at it in terms of, as the Australian Defence Force is doing, what about your land transport? What about your Navy? How do you decarbonize that? And in terms of the tourism and transport sector, Margie, I mean, I'm sure you have a lot of tour buses and other transport vehicles that currently use diesel. So how do you decarbonize those vehicles? And I mean, EVs is one technology, but for some of these heavy vehicles and heavy transport, you still need fossil diesel. So I think it needs to be a holistic policy. It needs to be a holistic biofuels policy. And that's what's really needed in terms of policy development here in Australia.
Do any of the other sort of panelists have a view, maybe Margie, on the renewable diesel side of tourism and the industry?
I completely agree. I think, we're a bit focused on the SAF today for obviously very good reasons, but, I represent the cruise industry. I represent a lot of that land-based travel and the challenges around maritime fuel in this space and what that's going to look like, and the challenges for anyone who operates around Australia or has to have goods transported to them. The logistics of the tourism industry are also going to present a whole range of challenges, which is why we're doing a lot of decarbonisation work in a larger sustainability and fuel space, and working with the Climate Change Commissioner and others on this to start the thought process and the debate. But once again, it does come back to that skills issue here in Australia. When you look at the breadth of the sustainability challenge for the tourism sector, we are going to need experts in that space, and we just don't have them at the moment here in sufficient numbers.
Here's hoping to fill up on a tank of renewable diesel on my way to Taylor Swift. Unfortunately, I couldn't get tickets for that one. Any other? Oh, here we go. One question over there.
Yes, hi, Stephen Forshaw from Airbus. A couple of questions for Graham. No, it's all right. No, actually, a question for Margie. No, I'll take those ones offline. Margie, I was really pleased to hear you say that you had put a very direct recommendation to government about putting some money on the table, and you actually put a number on it, and congratulations for that. Now the other side, 300 million, I think we've heard the scale of the challenges this morning is not really going to be enough. Shouldn't we really be looking at something akin to Hydrogen Head Start? Can you just walk me through how you thought about that number? What led you to come to the number? I don't want to quibble over a few dollars here and there, but there must be some thinking around why don't we get to the scale of Hydrogen Head Start at sort of 2 billion or so to start getting this industry moving and to de-risk particularly the early projects?
I think it would probably be fair to say, early on in the conversation at this point in time, that 300 million figure is the product of conversation across the board with our peers within industry about what we thought might, no pun intended, fly. So from our point of view, that's certainly only starter cash, and that's intended to be only over this period of the 4-year estimates, and very specifically around stimulating innovation and just literally getting the ball rolling. Because when you compare the figures here and other parts of the world, it's embarrassing. From our point of view, though, that doesn't step away from what should be happening at state level in addition. And increasingly in states like Queensland, who for quite a considerable period of time had a Biofutures Commission and been engaged in this space, there's a huge level of interest and desire for change, simply because, as a state like Queensland is really the long haul issue from an aviation perspective, and their desire to get more flights into far north Queensland from parts of Asia is stimulating a lot of activity there. I'm going to have to say I don't have the definitive answer in this, but I think it's really important, as a show of faith, if you like, that government puts in place at least something of this measure to get started, and that then becomes an active encourager at state level all around the country as well. So, but I just want to press that exercise around the states, because they have responsibility here too.
Hi, I'm Pauline Kennedy from BP, and my question's for Gabrielle. Just in the context of what you're planning for your piloting and testing for defence, do you think that you'd have a preference for locally produced SAF and renewable diesel that comes from locally produced feed? Yep.
Yeah, thanks. I'll talk a little bit more about it this afternoon, but the attraction for us around locally produced, something that is onshore and not subject to the lines of supply coming internationally, is fuel security, energy security, and I think the LanzaJet speaker spoke to this morning. We know that if we're a fossil fuel importing nation, which we are, if we become a renewable fuel importing nation, and worse still, we export all of our feedstocks or some of our feedstocks and then buy it back in again, well, we're at risk of making potentially the same error that we've made with other industries in Australia. So we've got an opportunity in this transition to address our vulnerability as a fuel importing nation through some form of onshore industry, ideally sovereign owned, would start to contribute to those national security objectives.
I'm on. This is a question for Graham. I'm Howard Burville from Woodbecker. I was very pleased to see that you're looking at the supply chain of raw material with agriculture, but I was a little bit surprised you hadn't listed forest residues, because they're already concentrated in many places, especially now there's been a push from the last COP that we need to build more in timber, and we're about to accelerate our building of housing, I hope, in Australia, so that there'll be a lot more residues in locations like sawmills. Was there a reason why you haven't considered forestry and wood waste?
No, it's good. That's a good call out. Probably we need to do more work on it. So I've had a number of proponents start to tell me about it, but you've highlighted there the attributes that do help. It's the aggregation is such a key bit, as you'll probably know, and then the scale, and does that then imply a kind of a hub and spoke kind of production model? But it wasn't a deliberate point. It's probably something we need to look into a bit more. As you probably got from the presentation, we're open to anything and all feedstocks, as long as it's at scale and can be sort of contracted on a long-term basis.
Yeah, that shouldn't be a problem. And Jimmy mentioned that wood waste is a good resource, so that's worth exploring.
Okay, well, I think that does us for time. What I would invite you is to maybe approach our panellists over some lunch and coffee. I'm sure that they'll have many more answers for you. But again, I'd just like to thank our panellists here today.